What if the boats that could shut down one of the world's busiest oil routes were never actually sitting where anyone could see them? Picture a cliff on a quiet coastline, nothing but rock as far as the camera can see. Then, a section of that rock splits open, and a dozen small boats shoot out toward open water before anyone watching from above even has time to react. Before we get into what just happened to these hidden bases, hit like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this kind of careful, fact-checked breakdown reach more people instead of the exaggerated version flooding your feed. Subscribe if you want the accurate story instead of the loudest headline, and share this with someone who's been trying to understand what's really happening along Iran's coast, because most coverage is skipping the part that actually matters. Let's start with what these hidden bases actually are, because once you understand the concept, the rest of the story falls into place. For roughly 2 decades, Iran's naval forces have been carving fortified tunnel and cave complexes straight into the rocky terrain along its southern coast and on strategic islands sitting inside the region's most contested waterway. These aren't bunkers in the traditional sense. They're built specifically to shelter small, fast attack boats close enough to the water that they can launch within minutes while staying completely hidden from ordinary surveillance. Analysts tracking this kind of infrastructure believe Iran has built a meaningful number of these hidden bases, engineered with piers carved directly into the rock so that small vessels can be moored, sheltered, and sent back out almost instantly. Here's why that matters so much tactically, and it's honestly one of the more fascinating engineering stories buried inside this entire conflict. A conventional warship is a large, obvious target. It shows up clearly on radar, it's visible from satellites, and it's relatively easy to strike once real fighting begins, which is largely what happened to much of Iran's traditional navy in the earliest weeks of this war. A small, fast boat tucked inside a cave carved beneath a rock overhang is essentially invisible from above. It doesn't register the way a warship does, and unless you already know exactly where to look, there's very little in standard surveillance imagery that separates a genuine hideout from ordinary coastline. Let's walk through the broader timeline here, because context matters enormously for understanding why this specific target category has stayed relevant for so long. In the earliest phase of this war, air power went after Iran's conventional naval assets aggressively, striking ports, coastal missile batteries, and no naval bases in a sustained early campaign that severely weakened the surface fleet within the first several weeks of fighting. Independent estimates from that early period suggest a significant majority of Iran's visible fast attack fleet was destroyed or damaged in that initial wave, a genuinely major blow to the country's conventional naval posture. So if that much of the surface fleet was already hit early on, why are these coastal hideouts still being discussed as a live, relevant threat months later? This is where the story becomes far more interesting than a simple story of destruction would suggest. According to multiple independent assessments, even after that early wave of destruction, Iran's underground coastal infrastructure continued sheltering a meaningful majority of its remaining fast attack capability well into the following months, protected specifically by the fact that these vessels were never sitting in the kind of exposed positions that made the surface fleet so vulnerable in the first place. Now let's talk about what's actually confirmed to have happened over the past week or so, because this is genuinely where the whole story behind this video comes from. And I want to be precise about what's verified versus what's still speculation floating around online. Multiple strike. Operations have been confirmed against coastal military facilities across several key locations tied to this hidden infrastructure, with officials describing operations specifically aimed at weakening coastal defense systems, missile storage and launch positions, and coastal surveillance capability. I want to be careful about one specific claim here, because I've seen it stated with far more confidence online than the actual reporting supports, and separating those two things is exactly the point of a breakdown like this one. Some corners of the internet are treating this week's strikes as the moment the underground tunnel network itself, the actual carved-out boat pens, finally got cracked open and destroyed. What's actually confirmed is that recent operations hit the coastal military footprint surrounding these facilities, the defense systems, the storage sites, the surveillance infrastructure, rather than a specifically confirmed breach of the hardened cave systems themselves. That's an important distinction to sit with. Hitting the surrounding coastal military footprint is real and confirmed. Claiming the hardened tunnels themselves have been definitively cracked open isn't something the available reporting currently supports. And I'd treat anyone stating that with total confidence as speculating past what's actually been verified. Let's talk for a moment about why these particular hardened facilities have proven so difficult to fully neutralize. Because understanding the underlying engineering challenge is genuinely useful, not just for this story, but for understanding underground warfare more broadly. Hardened facilities carved directly into solid rock represent one of the toughest target categories in modern military operations. You're not dealing with a structure that collapses from a nearby blast. You're dealing with meters of dense natural rock, functioning as its own form of armor, resistant to exactly the kind of conventional strikes that work reliably against surface targets. Destroying a facility built this way typically requires specialized penetrating munitions, engineered to bury deep before detonating, combined with precise intelligence on the internal layout, so a strike doesn't simply crater an entrance while whatever's sheltered deeper inside stays completely untouched. Even then, facilities built with multiple redundant entrances and internal chambers, which is exactly how analysts describe this category of coastal infrastructure, can often continue partial operations even after one access point gets sealed off entirely. This is genuinely one of the hardest problems in air campaign planning, and it's a significant part of why, months into a sustained campaign against Iran's naval infrastructure, this specific category of threat has proven so persistently difficult to fully eliminate. Think about it from the perspective of the people actually planning these strikes for a moment. Every single mission against a target, like this, requires an entirely different kind of intelligence than a strike against a visible building or a parked vehicle. You need to know not just where an entrance sits, but how deep the tunnel runs, whether it branches, where the boats are actually moored once inside, and whether the geology of that particular stretch of coastline even allows a penetrating weapon to reach far enough to matter. Get any one of those details wrong, and a strike that looks devastating on camera might barely scratch the actual capability sheltered underneath. That's precisely why campaigns against this kind of target take months instead of days, and why dramatic footage of an explosion on a hillside almost never tells you the full story of what was actually destroyed. There's also a training and personnel dimension worth understanding here, because a network of hidden bases only works as an effective deterrent if the crews operating out of it are genuinely skilled at executing the tactics the infrastructure was built to enable. Specialized naval units tied to this kind of asymmetric capability reportedly train extensively in the exact swarming and rapid deployment techniques this coastal cave network is designed to support, giving the infrastructure real operational teeth rather than functioning as passive storage alone. That combination, hardened concealment plus a trained, practiced crew ready to deploy on short notice, is what actually makes this threat persistent rather than theoretical. And it's part of why degrading the surrounding coastal footprint matters even without a confirmed breach of the tunnels themselves, since disrupting logistics, communications, and surveillance capability around these bases still meaningfully complicates how effectively they can actually be used. Let's talk about why Iran built the system in the first place, because the underlying strategic logic tells you a great deal about how a smaller regional power approaches fighting a much larger conventional military, and it's genuinely worth understanding on its own terms. Iran has known for decades that it cannot realistically build a navy capable of matching a major global power ship for ship. Rather than attempting that losing proposition, military planners made a deliberate bet on asymmetric warfare instead, favoring large numbers of small, cheap, fast, and expendable vessels over a handful of expensive ships that would likely be destroyed early in any serious conflict. The doctrine behind this approach is often described as swarming, dozens of small craft launching from scattered hidden locations and converging on a target simultaneously, overwhelming defenses through sheer volume and unpredictability, rather than relying on the firepower of any single vessel. The underground cave bases exist specifically to protect that swarming capability from exactly the kind of sustained air campaign that has been running against Iran's more visible assets, keeping enough boats alive and hidden that the underlying threat to shipping persists, regardless of how many larger, more visible vessels get destroyed elsewhere. There's a certain brutal elegance to that strategy worth appreciating, even if you're rooting for the other side of this conflict. Instead of trying to build a handful of ships that could theoretically go toe-to-toe with a modern navy, and almost certainly lose, Iran essentially decided to make the entire equation about numbers and unpredictability instead. A defender facing 20 small boats converging from 20 different directions at once has to make split-second decisions about which threats are real and which are decoys, all while every single boat is cheap enough to lose without meaningfully denting the overall capability. That's the kind of math that keeps naval planners up at night, because it turns a contest of firepower into a contest of attention and reaction time instead. Quick pause here, because if you've stuck with this breakdown this far, you clearly want the real picture instead of the headline version. Drop a comment telling us which part of this story surprised you most, the cave engineering, the swarming tactics, or the mine warfare piece we're about to get into, because your comments genuinely shape what we dig into next. It's also worth understanding that these coastal boat caves aren't the only piece of Iran's broader underground defense philosophy, and placing them alongside the country's other hardened infrastructure helps explain why this entire strategic approach has proven so resilient over time. Iran has separately built extensive underground tunnel networks specifically for missile storage and launch capability, engineered around the same core principle, exploit naturally dense mountainous terrain to build infrastructure that a conventional air campaign simply cannot neutralize in a single decisive pass. Whether the target category is fast attack boats sheltered in coastal caves or missiles stored deep inside mountain tunnels, the underlying doctrine is identical: force an adversary into a long, grinding, resource-intensive campaign rather than a single, quick, decisive engagement. There's one specific vulnerability worth mentioning here, because it pushes back against the idea that facilities like this are completely invincible by design. Reporting on Iran's broader underground infrastructure has noted that in some of these networks, stored munitions sit relatively close together along continuous corridors without extensive internal compartmentalization separating different storage sections. That detail matters tactically because it suggests a successful penetrating strike into the right internal chamber could potentially trigger secondary detonations that cascade through a larger section of a facility than a single strike would normally achieve against a properly compartmentalized target. There's no independent confirmation that the same internal layout applies specifically to the coastal boat caves, as opposed to the missile storage networks, but it's a useful reminder that hardened doesn't automatically mean flawless, and the actual internal engineering of any specific facility matters enormously to how survivable it really is once it takes a serious, well-placed hit. Let's think through this like a targeting analyst for a moment, because understanding why these specific caves have proven so hard to deal with is genuinely fascinating from a professional standpoint, not just a dramatic one. Hardened underground facilities carved into solid rock are consistently ranked among the toughest target categories in modern warfare. You're not dealing with a structure that collapses when a blast goes off nearby. You're dealing with meters of dense natural rock functioning as its own form of protective armor, a barrier that even the most advanced penetrating munitions struggle against, depending on the specific density and composition of the surrounding stone. Some of Iran's broader underground facilities reportedly include internal transport systems connecting assembly areas, storage depots, and multiple concealed exits, essentially functioning as a hidden underground settlement rather than a simple bunker with one obvious point of vulnerability. While that level of internal complexity has been more thoroughly documented for Iran's inland missile storage networks than for the coastal boat caves specifically, the underlying construction philosophy across Iran's hardened infrastructure appears broadly consistent. Exploit naturally dense terrain, build multiple redundant entrances and internal chambers, and force any attacker into a target that resists being fully neutralized with a single strike. Let's also touch on Iran's submarine capability here, because it connects directly to the same broader coastal defense story and rarely gets discussed alongside it, even though it represents another piece of the same underlying strategic logic. Iran's submarine fleet is considerably smaller and less capable than a major global power's, built around a mix of older imported vessels and domestically produced smaller submarines, specifically designed for shallow coastal operations and mine laying within the confined waters of the region's most contested waterway. Iran has also reportedly fielded mid-sized submarines capable of extended underwater operation, armed with a combination of torpedoes, naval mines, and cruise missiles, giving the force meaningful reach, even though it doesn't come close to rivaling a modern major power submarine fleet in raw capability. None of that fleet is designed to win a direct undersea confrontation with a superior conventional navy, and that was never really the point of building it. Just like the fast boats hidden in the coastal caves, Iran's submarine force exists specifically to complicate an adversary's operating picture in a narrow, congested waterway, adding one more layer of asymmetric threat that a much larger conventional navy has to account for every single time it moves through contested waters. This is genuinely the through line connecting every piece of Iran's coastal defense strategy. Coastal boat caves for swarming attacks on shipping, underground tunnel networks for longer range, strike capability elsewhere in the country, mine laying capacity woven throughout contested waters, and a modest but real submarine presence, adding another unpredictable variable beneath the surface, all built around the same core doctrine of making any adversary's campaign slow and expensive rather than fast and clean. Analysts tracking Iran's broader underground infrastructure have identified suspected or confirmed hardened sites scattered across multiple provinces, suggesting this isn't a single isolated facility type, but a genuinely nationwide defensive philosophy built up gradually over more than a decade, well before this current conflict ever began. Understanding that broader pattern matters, because it tells you this specific coastal hideout story isn't an isolated curiosity. It's one visible piece of a much larger, deliberately dispersed defensive architecture that Iran has been investing in patiently for a very long time, anticipating exactly this kind of sustained conventional air campaign long before it actually arrived. Let's also talk about the human and economic dimension of this specific corner of the war, because it's easy to get lost purely in the hardware conversation and lose sight of the broader cost involved. Reports from within the affected region describe civilian casualties connected to this sustained campaign, a reminder that these coastal facilities aren't sitting in some completely isolated military zone. They're woven into stretches of coastline where ordinary infrastructure and ordinary people exist too, and that reality doesn't disappear just because a target carries military significance. Let's also look at the economic dimension running in parallel to these strikes, because a sustained blockade affecting the same region has become a significant and somewhat underdiscussed part of the broader story, and it likely matters more to Iran's long-term strategic calculus than any single strike does on its own. A sustained naval blockade affecting Iranian shipping has reportedly cost the country a substantial amount in lost trade revenue, a genuinely significant drain on an economy already under considerable strain from years of prior sanctions before this specific conflict even began. Enforcement of that blockade has reportedly intercepted numerous vessels attempting to move through it, though independent shipping industry tracking suggests a meaningful number of vessels have still managed to bypass it despite sustained enforcement efforts, which tells you the blockade, while genuinely damaging, isn't fully airtight either. So, you have a two-track campaign running simultaneously here, direct strikes against Iran's remaining naval assets and hidden boat infrastructure on one track, and a substantial economic chokehold through the blockade on the other, both clearly designed to work together toward the same broader strategic goal. It's worth sitting with just how much slower and quieter this economic pressure is compared to the strikes themselves, because that difference in pace is part of the point. A missile strike happens in seconds and generates dramatic footage within minutes. A blockade works over weeks and months, tightening gradually in a way that rarely produces a single viral moment, but that can ultimately squeeze a government's ability to function far more effectively than any individual strike ever could on its own. Revenue loss today doesn't show up as an explosion tonight. It shows up months later as a currency under pressure, as fuel shortages at home, as a government forced to choose between funding its military and funding basic services. That's a genuinely different kind of warfare, easy to overlook precisely because it doesn't produce footage that spreads on social media the way a strike does. Now here's a genuinely important wrinkle in this story that deserves more attention than it typically gets, and it's a good example of why you should stay skeptical of any single dramatic headline claiming total decisive victory. The destruction of much of Iran's conventional navy in this war's opening weeks did not stop Iran's broader ability to threaten shipping through the region's most contested waterway. Defense analysts have specifically noted that the conventional fleet never played a meaningful role in this particular asymmetric threat to begin with, because that threat was always centered on exactly the hidden, dispersed boat network we've been discussing throughout this breakdown. That's a striking point worth sitting with. Sinking the large, expensive, prestigious warships barely mattered to Iran's actual disruptive capability, because the real threat was never really built around those vessels in the first place. Let's also touch briefly on mine-laying capability, because it connects directly to the same coastal infrastructure story and rarely gets mentioned alongside it. A meaningful portion of Iran's mine-laying capacity reportedly survived the earliest, most intense weeks of this air campaign, which matters enormously for the region's contested waterway. Mine warfare is a genuinely underrated threat in modern naval conflict, because unlike a missile or a torpedo, a mine doesn't need continuous guidance or a crew standing by to fire it. It can sit dormant in a shipping lane for weeks or months, forcing any adversary attempting to clear it into slow, methodical operations that are themselves extremely vulnerable to exactly the kind of ambush tactics these hidden fast boats specialize in. In other words, even in a scenario where active fighting wound down relatively soon, the mines and the boats capable of defending them would still represent a serious, lingering hazard to commercial shipping, trying to safely transit through this region again, potentially requiring months of careful, dangerous clearance work long after any formal resolution to the broader conflict. Taken together, what you're really looking at is a layered defensive philosophy built patiently over roughly 2 decades. Coastal boat caves for swarming attacks on shipping, underground tunnel networks for longer-range strike capability, a mine-laying capacity woven throughout the same waters, and a modest but real submarine presence, adding one more unpredictable variable beneath the surface. No single piece of that system is enough to defeat a major conventional military in a straight fight, and no serious analyst, including within Iran's own military establishment historically, has ever claimed otherwise. But as a combined package, it's specifically engineered to make any adversary's campaigns slow, expensive, and messy rather than fast and clean. It's worth pausing on why mine warfare specifically pairs so well with this coastal cave strategy, because the two threats reinforce each other in a way that makes clearing either one considerably more dangerous and time-consuming. A shipping lane suspected of containing mines can't simply be declared clear based on visual inspection alone. It requires slow, methodical sweeping operations, often conducted by specialized vessels, moving at a fraction of normal speed, deliberately exposing themselves for extended periods in exactly the kind of contested waters where hidden fast boats are specifically positioned to strike. That combination means a mine-clearing operation isn't just slow and expensive on its own. It's also genuinely dangerous, because the vessels conducting it are uniquely vulnerable to the swarming tactics this entire coastal infrastructure network was built to enable in the first place. This is part of why any realistic path toward fully reopening contested waters to normal commercial traffic likely requires addressing both threats simultaneously rather than sequentially, since neutralizing the mines without also neutralizing the boats capable of defending them leaves the clearing operation dangerously exposed throughout. Let's also think through what a genuinely stable long-term outcome might actually require here, because it's worth being honest that neither a purely military solution nor a purely diplomatic one has fully resolved this specific threat category up to this point in the conflict. A purely military solution would likely require the kind of sustained, resource-intensive campaign capable of systematically locating and destroying every hardened facility along an extensive stretch of coastline, an undertaking that historical precedent suggests takes considerably longer and costs considerably more than initial campaign planning typically anticipates. A purely diplomatic solution would require Iran's leadership to voluntarily agree to constraints on exactly the asymmetric capability that has proven most effective at imposing cost and uncertainty on a far larger conventional adversary, which is a difficult concession for any government to make, particularly one already under significant domestic and economic strain. The more realistic path likely involves some combination of both. Continued military pressure gradually raising the cost of maintaining this infrastructure, alongside diplomatic negotiations that eventually address the underlying security concerns, driving both sides' calculations, rather than either track achieving a clean, unilateral resolution on its own. Let's also touch on the diplomatic backdrop here, because these strikes aren't happening in a vacuum separate from broader negotiations, and it's easy to forget that while watching strike footage on repeat. This entire conflict traces back through multiple collapsed rounds of ceasefire talks and renewed fighting, each cycle raising and then dashing hopes that a durable resolution might finally be close. Reports suggest diplomatic contact, even if informal or indirect, hasn't completely gone dark, despite the sustained military pressure continuing in parallel. Wars like this one often end up being resolved through exactly this kind of parallel track: military pressure on one side, quiet diplomatic contact on the other, rather than either channel operating in complete isolation from the other. Before we bring this together, one more thing worth doing. If this kind of grounded breakdown, one that separates what's actually confirmed from what's just loud speculation online, is something you want more of, go ahead and subscribe with notifications turned on, because this specific thread of the story is clearly going to keep developing. It's also worth spending a moment on how this specific kind of warfare, hitting dispersed, hidden, hardened infrastructure repeatedly over an extended period, actually plays out in practice, because it's a very different experience than the dramatic single-strike footage that tends to go viral online. This isn't one clean, decisive operation. It's multiple separate strike packages spread across weeks, each one working off updated intelligence, each one accepting that a single pass likely won't achieve full success, each one requiring the same rigorous verification process, regardless of how repetitive the broader campaign might start to feel to anyone following along from the outside. That grinding, iterative reality is genuinely hard to capture in a headline promising something got completely obliterated. But it's a far more accurate description of how a campaign against hardened, dispersed infrastructure like this one actually unfolds in practice. Let's also consider what happens if this cat and mouse dynamic simply continues indefinitely, because that's a genuinely useful scenario to think through rather than assuming one side inevitably achieves a clean total victory. If underground infrastructure keeps sheltering a meaningful percentage of remaining capability, no matter how many strikes get run against the surrounding coastal footprint, and if the campaign isn't willing to accept the cost of the kind of sustained ground operation that might be needed to physically clear these networks, you could reasonably end up with a long-term equilibrium, sporadic strikes, and a costly blockade continuing indefinitely without either side achieving a clean final resolution. That's not a dramatic conclusion, and it's not the kind of ending that makes for a satisfying headline, but it's actually the most historically consistent outcome when you look at how similar campaigns against hardened, dispersed defensive networks have played out in other conflicts over recent decades. Let me give you the clearest possible summary of what's confirmed versus what remains uncertain here, because that's the responsible way to close out a story with this many moving parts. Confirmed, Iran has built and maintained an extensive network of hardened cave and tunnel bases along its southern coastline and on strategic islands, specifically to shelter its fast attack boat fleet from exactly this kind of sustained air campaign. Confirmed, recent operations have struck military facilities, coastal defense systems, missile storage sites, and surveillance infrastructure at multiple coastal locations repeatedly over the past several weeks. Confirmed, a meaningful majority of Iran's surviving fast attack fleet remained sheltered inside these underground facilities as of the most recent independently reviewable estimates. Uncertain whether this most recent wave of strikes represents a meaningful escalation specifically against the hardened tunnel infrastructure itself, as opposed to continued pressure on the surrounding coastal military footprint, since no confirmed breach of the deep cave systems themselves currently appears in available reporting. Treat any claim to the contrary with real skepticism until that's independently confirmed. Here's the actual bottom line worth carrying forward from everything we've covered tonight. What Iran built along its coastline is a genuinely effective, low-cost solution to a problem every smaller military eventually faces when confronting a vastly larger conventional force. And the fact that it's still functioning at meaningful capacity this deep into one of the most intense air campaigns in recent memory tells you something important about the real limits of even overwhelming air power against dispersed, hardened, hidden infrastructure. Significant damage has clearly been done to Iran's conventional naval capability, and steady pressure continues grinding away at the coastal military footprint surrounding these hideouts specifically. But the honest picture right now is one of sustained attrition rather than a single knockout blow against this particular category of threat. That's a more useful way to understand where this specific thread of the war is actually headed than any headline promising instant total victory, because conflicts against dispersed, well-hidden, asymmetric infrastructure like this one tend to resolve through exactly this kind of grinding, incremental pressure rather than one dramatic, decisive moment. Every single piece we've walked through tonight points toward the same conclusion. This war isn't being decided by the biggest single explosion or the most dramatic piece of footage. It's being decided by which side can absorb the slow, grinding cost of a fight that was never designed to end quickly in the first place. Iran built these caves knowing exactly this kind of sustained pressure was coming, decades before the first strike of this war ever landed. And the fact that so much of that hidden capability is still functioning, even now, is the clearest evidence available that patience, not raw firepower alone, has been the actual currency of this entire conflict from day one. Drop a comment with your own take. Does a dispersed, low-cost defense system like this one realistically hold out indefinitely against a sustained modern air campaign? Or is it just a matter of time before attrition eventually wins out completely? Every comment gets read, and a lot of what gets covered next comes directly out of those conversations. So weigh in, and if there's a specific angle of this story worth a deeper breakdown, let us know that too. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one, the moment there's something real and genuinely verified worth bringing to you.